friends, Krista here. Thanks for stopping by Books and Jams. Today I'm going to talk about all of the books that I read in the month of January. And there's a lot of them. I read 14 books in the month of January, which is incredible. And I've been saying that I don't think I want to read quite as much, but then I had such a huge reading month. So I don't know, maybe this is just my jam now. We shall see. I feel like I got a lot of other things done. I watched TV, I watched some Netflix, I hung out with people, I went to volleyball, I did stuff, right? But I still read a lot of books. So let's just jump right in. Typically, I will be doing a mid-month wrap-up so that I don't have quite so many to talk about at the end of the month. I just didn't have time in January to fit that in. Here it is. We're going to talk about 14 books today. Yikes! That's a lot of books. And I'm excited because I had what I think is going to be my favorite book of the year, or at least up there among my favorites. And I'm going to end with that. So stay tuned for that book. I did finish it on the 31st. So if you watched my February TBR, you may have seen it because I did finish one of those books that I was holding over. But first I want to start with the books that were part of my TBR unhaul project. In January 2017 and in January 2018, I had 5 books that were on those TBRs that I never read. So my challenge was to either read these books or get rid of them, and I have one save. So I did read Winter Solstice. I actually listened to this on audio using Hoopla through my library, and I really enjoyed it. We follow quite a cast of characters in here, and it takes place in the weeks leading up to Christmas. So it's kind of about the way that these characters all come together, become this found family. It was really lovely, very homey, cozy. We're sitting around fires, preparing for Christmas, walking through some grief and some difficult situations, but also making these connections with other people. I really just found this to be a lovely read. I'm so glad that I finally read it. It is a bit of a chunker, but the audiobook went by really quickly. It was lovely. I loved it. Happy I read that. My save is going to be Sacred Rhythms by Ruth Haley Barton because this is a book I want to have forever, and I'm in the middle of it right now. So I'm not counting it as read because I didn't finish it, but I am going to finish it in February, so it is on my February TBR. And this is just one that I'm really enjoying so far, talking about the rhythms of our faith, of my faith walk, different elements that I could work into my faith, things like solitude and silence and prayer and honoring your body, self-examination, discernment, Sabbath or rest, cultivating these rhythms into your life to have some spiritual transformation. I'm really excited about continuing this read, and I definitely don't want to unhaul it, which means these 3 are getting unhauled, okay? So March by Geraldine Brooks, which is sort of a riff off of Little Women where we follow the father. I did start this. I got maybe 10 or 15 pages in and it wasn't capturing my attention. So I'm okay to see this one go by. But I'm really sad about this one. I'm not sad, but I know some of you are going to be sad. I know this has incredibly high ratings and it's super short. All 3 of these are really short. I have started this one as well. Not this month, but last month or in November. And I got 35 pages into it and also really wasn't enjoying it. Wasn't getting the hype. I was very distracted while reading it. I just couldn't get into it. It is a nonfiction by Ta-Nehisi Coates, written to his son, just about the world and life. And I know that it has very high praise. Please don't hate me. We can still be friends, but I'm unhauling it. And lastly, I'm unhauling Balzac the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai Siji. I don't know anything about this one. It has been on my shelves for a little while, and I've never, it was on a TBR at some point. I wanted to pick it up, but I never did. So I'm unhauling those 3 books. Yikes. But let's move on. I have 13 more books to talk about, and I'm really excited to talk about these books. For the Lord of the Read-Along that I'm hosting with Sarah from Sarah's Nightstand, in January we all read The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This, when it was written, was middle grade. I guess now you'd probably call it YA. It is written for a younger audience. It was so much fun. This was a reread for me, and I absolutely loved it. I had forgotten. It had been a few years since I last read this, and I forgot how funny it was. Honestly, there were so many humorous moments in this book. Gandalf is snarky and pushes Bilbo Baggins out of his comfort zone. If you're not aware, this is an adventure tale. Bilbo Baggins is a hobbit, and he's very comfortable being in his cozy little hobbit hole in the Shire, living his quiet, simple life. Gandalf is a wizard. He comes to Bilbo one day and asks him to join on this adventure. Bilbo says, "No way, Jose." The next day, all of these dwarves show up. 13 of them show up, and Bilbo is kind of roped into this adventure without his 100% consent. And we really get to watch Bilbo change and develop and grow and be pushed out of his comfort zone throughout the story. The 14 of them, 15 with Gandalf at the beginning and then 14 as he kind of leaves them to their own devices, travel across mountains and through scary woods with life-size spiders that attack them, and they meet elves, different kinds of elves, kind elves and elves that put them in prison, and goblins and trolls and wolves and eagles and a dragon and men. And there's a big battle at the end, which was my least favorite part, to be honest. I really love so much of this book. I love when they're walking through the woods and the spiders and the elves and how Bilbo uses the ring that he found when he was with Gollum. I love the part with Gollum and the riddles. I love the part with Smaug the dragon and the conversations that Bilbo has with the dragon. I feel like the Smaug part was ultimately the dwarves are trying to take back their mountain where this dragon has confiscated, kicked them all out of their home and confiscated all of their treasure. The dwarves are determined to take back their mountain, the Lonely Mountain. And this is what they're all leading up to. And Smaug the dragon, I feel like his part was so short. I feel like it was slightly anticlimactic. And then afterwards, there's this huge battle in order to kind of solidify the dwarves returning home to their mountain. The battle part at the end is my least favorite, which makes me a little nervous for the Lord of the Rings trilogy because I know there's going to be some battle scenes in there that I'm just not looking forward to. But ultimately, I gave this 5 stars, really loved it, so excited to continue on for the first time with the Lord of the Rings. Yikes. In my Goodreads read-along group, we read the Snowflower and the Secret Fan by Lisa C. I gave this 4 stars. I really loved this historical fiction. We got a really great glimpse into the lives of women in this particular cultural group in China. I don't think it's across China is so huge, and I'm sure there's so many different cultural groups, but we learn about the Yan people. I don't know. I don't remember the name of the people group that are that we talk about in this book. We follow Lily all the way from young childhood through old age, and it's written from her perspective. She, when she is quite young, is matched with an old same, another young girl whose birthday is the same, their foot size is the same. They have a lot of different aspects of their life that are the same, that are similar. They both lost a younger sister. They are both eldest daughters, on and on and on. So they are matched together, and we follow their friendship really from childhood all the way through adulthood, into marriage, into foot binding when they're young, which was horrifying and made me physically react. Very intense process and saddening that was part of their culture at the time. I was really frustrated with Lily at certain times. I found her to be a little bit selfish, especially as they got older, and the way her lifestyle totally changed once she was married, and the way she then treated her old same, Snowflower. When Snowflower had been so kind and gracious, slightly secretive as well, we learn, and we could see that as a reader. Lily felt very betrayed because she didn't know all the aspects of Snowflower's life, and I think she took it out on her in awful ways, and I was really frustrated with her. And that might be why I only gave it 4 stars instead of 5. But looking back, this really could be a 5-star read. It was moving and powerful and quiet at the same time. We learned so much about this culture. I loved all the singing. I was particularly interested in the fact that there was so much singing at all of the different, every time the women would gather, they would sing songs either about the person who's getting married, or it was just so woven into their culture. I really found this very interesting, and loved it. I really enjoyed this one. The next two I'm going to talk about were from my 12 Books of Christmas book exchange that I did with Sarah's Nightstand and Lindsay's Little Library. I have the goal of kind of reading some of their books each month so I don't end up with these 24 books on my shelf at the end of the year unread. And I succeeded in January in reading one from each of them. From Lindsay, I read Still Alice by Lisa Genova. This was one that got the most comments when I unopened this book. I had read another book by Lisa Genova, and I was very excited to read more from her. So this one deals with a woman who is diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease when she's just 50 years old. She is a wife and a professor of linguistics, incredibly smart and brilliant, has written a book with her husband. She has 3 grown children who are successful and healthy, and she starts having problems with her memory, and then eventually discovers that she has Alzheimer's, and we're kind of in her head all the way through. I particularly liked how Lisa Genova structured the book to kind of mirror what was going on in Alice's head. So sometimes paragraphs would be repeated, or you could really feel the frustration when Alice would forget a word, and it would be something that she should know, and a lecture that she's delivered many times. It was heartbreaking. I was really frustrated with the husband in this book. I felt like his reactions to things, although possibly realistic, also were very frustrating. I wanted him to be so much more understanding and supportive, and there was such great love for his wife, but they had grown slightly distant even before she was diagnosed, and so it did feel realistic, his reactions to things, and he did still have so much love for his wife, but I was just really mad at him for the way he responded a few times. I liked the way that her relationships with her children progressed throughout the book as they learned about her illness and the way that they responded, and I just thought that this was a beautiful story. So well told, and Lisa Genova herself is a neuroscientist or neurosurgeon. I can't remember, but she works with brain stuff, so she knows her stuff when it comes to brain disease, and I would definitely highly recommend this book. I currently have the library out from the movie, but I currently have the movie out from the library, but I haven't yet read it. I'm hoping to do that before it's due back. The book that Sarah gave me that I read this month is Pride, Prejudice, and Other Flavors by Sonali Dev. I absolutely loved this Pride and Prejudice retelling. I thought it was clever and fun and witty. It comes from the perspective of an Indian American family, and I love that twist on the cultural pressure to get married that you see in Pride and Prejudice. The pressure that Mrs. Bennet puts on her daughters to make a good marriage, in this is translated into the pressure that this Indian American mother puts on her daughter to find a nice Indian man to marry. It is not a direct interpretation. It's not a direct retelling of Pride and Prejudice, but it's an interpretation of Pride and Prejudice. So there are some things that are a little bit different. There are some twists that are a little bit different. However, the main kind of themes and storylines and characters are all represented. Not all represented. There's a lot that's in Pride and Prejudice that is in this book as well. And I like that it wasn't completely direct. I like that there were some things that kept me guessing. But I liked every time I was like, ooh, that's a Pride and Prejudice. Ooh, that's Pride and Prejudice. I really had a lot of fun with this. Lots of smiles while I was reading. Definitely a fun romance. If you're a fan of Pride and Prejudice retellings and inspired type of books, I would definitely recommend picking this one up. I really enjoyed it. I need to go faster because I still have a lot of books to talk about. Okay, I'm going to talk about my middle grade books next because I can kind of fly through these. I read aloud to the kids I nanny Mr. Popper's Penguins by Richard and Florence Atwater. This was so nostalgic for me. I hadn't read this since I was quite young. We also watched the movie. Don't bother with the movie. It's so incredibly different from the book. This is so charming and silly and fun, and it's about this man, Mr. Popper, who has sent a penguin from an explorer in Antarctica. Like, what? That just wouldn't have happened ever. So you have to suspend disbelief, but I had a lot of fun reading this to the kids. We laughed a lot. It was very cute. There are some great like kind of full page illustrations throughout. Yeah, it was very silly and very fun, and I loved it. I made progress in 2 middle grade series this month. I read the 3rd in this Christmas series by Matt Haig with Father Christmas and Me. I can't talk very much about it because it is the 3rd in a series, but it's about Father Christmas and his continual struggle with the elf villain, if you will. And it was just a lovely kind of wrap up to this series. I feel like there could be more, because where's Rudolph? We haven't met Rudolph yet, so I feel like there could be more in this series coming. I guess we'll have to wait and see. Another 3rd book in a series is the Vanderbeekers to the Rescue. In this one, the lovely Vanderbeeker children, who absolutely adore animals, kind of unknowingly ruin their mom's baking business that she does from their kitchen at home. A health inspector comes to the door and they let him in when the parents aren't home, and she fails all the health inspection rules, and they try to reschedule a dive for her and try to rescue what they had messed up by redoing their house and painting the living room fuchsia pink in the middle of the night as a surprise. And somehow these animals keep showing up at their back stoop, and they are basically like becoming a rescue shelter for all of these animals, chickens and another dog and another cat and just all of these animals. And it's silly and lovable. I absolutely love the interaction between these siblings and their friends. I feel like they're left alone a little more than is realistic for a family living in New York City and Harlem. But it's still just lovely and so good. So good. Read the Vanderbeekers if you haven't yet, and if you're at all interested in middle grade family stories. Another middle grade that I absolutely loved is Song for a Whale by Lynn Kelly. I had brought this home from the library probably 4 or 5 times without reading it, having to return it when it was due, but I finally got around to reading it. I'm so thrilled. This is the story about a deaf girl named Iris who goes to a public school. She's having a really hard time making friends and finding her place. One day in an English class, she learns about this whale, Blue 55, who is based on the story of a true whale, who sings at a different frequency than his family. And so he is unable to be understood by any whales. He sings at a different frequency than any whale. So he swims around the ocean, calling out to different pods of whales. Some let him swim alongside of them for a while, until they don't, and he just continues to swim around the ocean. And she, Iris, is very technologically minded, which is a really fun characteristic to find in a middle grade young girl. She and her grandpa used to fix things, and she can take apart radios and put them back together, and that is a passion of hers. And her room is kind of like this hodgepodge of parts and pieces, and she goes to the junkyard to find things that she needs. And she decides she is going to figure out what frequency Blue 55 sings at and create music for him. She gets the band at her school involved. Her science teacher gets involved. She runs off with her deaf grandmother, and they go on a cruise together with the intent of finding Blue 55 and this sea life conservancy in Alaska, where he's potentially going to be, so that she can play her song for the whale. Oh, it's so heartwarming. It's so lovely and quirky. I love the way the family interacts with Iris. And the struggles that they have trying to communicate and just trying to bridge that gap between the hearing and the unhearing. It felt very real. Again, so much love, but sometimes there's a lot of miscommunication as well. So it really melted my heart. I just loved this book so much, and I'm so glad that I finally read it. It is 5 stars, and it will probably be among my favorites of the year as far as middle grade goes. But it's not March yet, so who knows what else I'll come across. But this one was definitely worth the read, and I absolutely loved it. The last middle grade that I read this month is The Goose Girl. I listened to this on audio. I was really sick a couple days ago, and I started this when I was on a walk during one of my weekend reading vlogs a week or so ago, and then just never picked it back up again. But the other day when I was really not feeling well, I didn't want to open a book and read. I had quite a headache and upset stomach. So I just listened to the Goose Girl on audio. It was a reread for me as well. I do have the next one in the Books of Bayern on my series books, Enna Burning. Enna is one of the characters in the Goose Girl, and I do want to make progress on that series, but I hadn't read it since 2016, I believe. So I wanted to revisit the Goose Girl and kind of get back into that world a little bit of Bayern, and now I'm ready to move forward in the series. It was a lovely fairy tale retelling, I believe, written by Shannon Hale. I absolutely loved it. Good job, me. Good job, Shannon Hale. Okay. I did read a nonfiction book this month, Before and After, and this is the true story of many people who were orphaned or who came through the Tennessee Children's Home Society, which is talked about in Lisa Wingate's book, Before We Were Yours, which I read 2 years ago and absolutely loved. I had lots of high hopes for this nonfiction book, and I really did enjoy hearing the stories of many of these people who were now searching for their families, their birth families. However, this book was a bit of a bummer for me. I feel like the structure of the book was its big letdown. Throughout the snippets or the anecdotes of these people's lives and their stories of coming through the children's home, we follow this group of people who are, well, we follow Judy Christie and Lisa Wingate and some of the orphans as they are putting together this reunion of other people who came through the Tennessee Children's Home. And it's a big part of the book. There's a lot of references to Before We Were Yours, and I felt like that really took away from the impact of these people's lives and their stories. I did only give this 3 stars because I wanted to honor those whose lives were impacted by Georgia Tann and her fraudulent ways. It didn't get into quite the horror that we read about in Before We Were Yours of some of the older kids and the things that they experienced, but so many children died because of Georgia Tann and her practices. She kidnapped people from their families and coerced young mothers to give up their children when maybe they really didn't want to. She was really an awful woman, and this book didn't focus so much on that, which is okay. It focused more on the lives of children who survived and who were adopted out into different families around the United States, and then their process of looking back to find their birth parents and the struggles that they had trying to get their records and to find their birth families, and then what happened once they did find them. So it was interesting, and it was I'm glad that I read it, but it definitely was a bit of a letdown because it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. Meh. I read a Book of the Month book. This is the first Book of the Month book I read this month. Yes. I'm hoping to read a Book of the Month book every month so that I can continue to justify being a member. But I read the 10,000 Doors of January. Obviously, it was January. I wanted to read this one in January. This was a fantasy. It is not a YA fantasy, although the main character is pretty young throughout a lot of this book. It has some darker, deeper themes that I guess the author is like, no way, it's not YA. It is adult fantasy. We follow January, who lives with a caregiver. He is not her father, kind of a surrogate father, foster father in a way. Her father travels the world collecting artifacts for her caregiver, who is a collector of things, and he's a part of this archaeological society. January is somewhat not imprisoned in this home of Mr. Locke, her caregiver, but she doesn't have a lot of freedom, and he is very strong-willed and wants her to be such a good girl, and she is determined to be a good girl, even though when she was quite younger she had this like boldness to her that she lost along the way. But when she becomes a teenager, she finds some of that boldness again. Some things happen that cause her to break out and escape from Mr. Locke. When she was quite young, she wrote something down on paper and it changed things in her world. So she has this ability that she doesn't really know what it is or hasn't really explored. It had to do with doors, obviously. But then when she gets to be a teenager, she finds this book called The 10,000 Doors. And so she begins reading this story. So throughout this book, we have this whole other story happening where we learn about Ada, who is a young woman who finds this door, and through this door comes this man from another world, or this young man from another world. She goes back to find this door later, and the door has been burned down. So we start to learn about the fact that there are these doors all around the world that lead to other worlds. So then here's the fantasy element of everything. It took me a little bit to get into this. It was a very gradual, it didn't ramp up the speed right away. It was a very slow build, this book. But by the end, I was in it. I felt like the pacing was a little bit slow at the beginning. But by the end, all of these things start to come together. This book that January is reading, her father and why he's traveling around the world, and these doors and these other worlds, and her ability to change the future by writing things down. Yeah, it all starts to come together in a very compelling and exciting way. I really like it. And something that is a little quirky about this book and the writing of it, which I enjoyed, is that Alex Harrow, plays a little bit with words themselves and letters themselves, and it would say like an H, like dual chimneys, or a Y that slices through time, or I don't know, just the way she describes letters in their actual format as representing something else is kind of cool. So that was a little bit of fun thrown into this other story, fantastical story about these doors. I really enjoyed this one. I gave it 4 stars. I thought it was a lot of fun. Even though it started out slow, the ending, it had a good momentum towards the end, and I was really pleased with it. So, yay. Yay for another Book of the Month Club book. Right towards the end of the month, I read a romance that I just randomly picked up from the library, Would Like to Meet, by Rachel Winters. I read this within a 24-hour period. I started it one evening and finished it the next day. It was the right book at the right time. It is a clean romance. All that we have is a kiss at the end. We follow Evie Summers, who is the assistant to an agent in the film industry. Her agent is working with this screenwriter who is contracted to write a rom-com. She becomes involved with helping this screenwriter to write this rom-com, even though he doesn't believe rom-coms are real, so why would he lower himself to write this kind of movie? He had received an Oscar for a previous film that he had written, so he doesn't want to lower himself to write rom-coms. So she decides to prove to him that rom-coms happen in real life, and she's gonna perform these meet cutes or set up these meet cutes for her to do all around the city with different men and fall in love, all within this 3-month period that he has to write his rom-com. So she does. She spills orange juice on someone in a cafe. She leaves her phone number in books at a bookstore. She goes on a road trip with a stranger that her friends kind of set up for her. I thought this was quirky and fun. Oh, and all the while, she writes about each of these experiences and sends them to the screenwriter, helping him to be inspired to write his rom-com. So when she always does her writing and summarizing all of this at the same cafe where she performed some of her meet cutes, and there's this single dad there with his daughter, and they become entwined with her embarrassing stories and within her story itself and become friends. It was so cute. I just thought this was lovely. I had such a fun time reading it. It was such a quick read. I loved Evie's friend group. They don't live in the same town, but they had been friends for a really long time, and I loved her friend group. I loved the bit of a love triangle that happens at the end. For a hot minute, you know it's going to kind of end up one way, but then you question it for a minute. Wait a minute, is she going to end up with this other person? You just don't know. The screenwriter is a typical arrogant, not typical, I shouldn't say that. I don't know any screenwriters, but he is a very arrogant, self-assured, handsome fella. And the single dad is kind of this dark, brooding widower, but loving single dad. Yeah, it just, it was so good. if you're looking for a quick, fun, clean romance, this might be the book for you. And now we come to the point in the video. This is already 34 minutes of footage, and I feel like I've talked a lot, so it's going to be hard to edit. This might be a long one, but I can't cut short talking about The Sun Does Shine. This is by Anthony Ray Hinton with Laura Love Hardin, and it's subtitled How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. So you guys know Just Mercy I read in December, and it was one of my favorite books it was my favorite book of 2019. I found it incredibly moving and compelling and heartbreaking and infuriating. Anthony Ray Hinton, who wrote The Sun Does Shine, is one of the cases that Bryan Stevenson ends up working with and talks about in Just Mercy. Well, this is Anthony Ray Hinton's memoir. We follow him from when he's a young kid, his relationship with his mom. He is his experience living in the Deep South with Jim Crow. Post-civil rights movement, still his schools have just been desegregated, but there's still a lot of hatred and animosity and antagonism and racism and horrible treatment that he receives even as a young kid. He talks about walking home with his friend Lester and like diving into ditches when they hear a car coming because they just don't know what's going to happen. So this fear that they lived with constantly as a kid. He grows up though, working, has decent jobs, goes to church, strong faith, great relationship with his mother. He's the baby of his family. And one day these cops show up at his house. He's mowing the lawn for his mom, and he is arrested and thrown into jail for murdering and robbing a store. And then they add 2 other instances of that same thing onto his on what they're accusing him of. He didn't do those things, and he has an alibi. He was working at overnight warehouse where he had to be like, where he was basically locked in, clocked in. The guard had to let him in and out. But they without any evidence and without any proof, Anthony Ray Hinton is convicted of murder and assault and robbery, multiple cases. He ends up spending almost 30 years in prison, or just about 30 years in prison, on death row, in a solitary cell, on death row, just feet away from where they electrocute people who become his family. He is there for so long that he talks about becoming family with the guards and the other inmates on death row, including a white man who is known for the last lynching that happened in Alabama and was part of the KKK. This book is chock full of grace, forgiveness, humor, heart, determination, and yet he doesn't gloss over the times where he is despairing and really has to struggle to find that hope. And he said for the first 3 years he was so filled with hatred that he didn't talk to anybody. He became a selective mute. He would only talk when his friend and mother came to visit for visiting hours. He refused to talk to anyone else for the first 3 or 4 years. He doesn't gloss over the difficulties, and yet he just was so incredible. We learn about what made him decide to continue to live and to fight. We see how he builds relationships with the other people that are on death row. We see him meet Bryan Stevenson, who ultimately is the one who plays a huge hand in helping him to be released. We see quotes from the prosecutor and the district attorney and the judge, which are just astoundingly horrible. We see Lester, his childhood friend who showed up. Oh man, I didn't think that was going to make me cry. We see Lester, his childhood friend, who showed up every single visiting hours to visit him for 30 years. We watch his mom get sick and him have to deal with that. Goodness. This book, I was weeping at the end. I teared up a couple times, but by the end, I was weeping at just this contrast of this horrible situation and this man, Anthony Ray Hinton, his light and his fight. the way that he was still able to find joy and humor and bring those things to other people, and the way that he found life. Oh, it was so heartbreaking when he got out. When he got out at the end, how he didn't know anything about cell phones and a GPS, and the world was just so incredibly different in those 30 years that he finds himself in the bathroom because it's the same size as what his cell was, and he falls asleep on the bathroom floor. This book wrecked me. It wrecked me. I feel like our country is so quick to condemn people instead of find any kind of redemptive or restitution for them, or I feel like there should be consequences. I'm okay with justice and I'm okay with consequences, but when 1 out of every 10 person on death row, one out of every 10 people on death row currently, or at least in 2017 when this was published, when 1 out of every 10 people is innocent based on past statistics, how can we justify the death penalty knowing that a good portion of them are innocent? It just doesn't seem right. Whew. Okay, so you should read this book. Clearly it was 5 stars. It will be among my favorites of the year, if not my favorite book of the year, and it's only January. I'm so excited that I feel this strongly about a favorite already. Okay, so here. Sorry for bumping the camera. So here, are they all in? Yes. Here are all the books that I read in January, plus the 2 others that are at the library, because I didn't have them. Okay, I'm going to put them down. I would love to chat with you about any of these books or any of the books that you read in the month of January. Did you have any favorites? Do you have any potential favorites of the year? Did you have any disappointments? Let's chat in the comments below. You guys know I love chatting with you down there. Also, give this video a big thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will be talking to you in another video very soon. Bye.